What if Izuku were the last creation of All for One? Izuku and Izumi and Ibarra. After the fall of All for One, the country began its reconstruction process. Though progress was slow, signs of improvement were already visible. However, many would never forget the horrors of war, as the scars of that conflict would remain. Because of this, peace was still fragile, held together by the trembling hands of the heroes who remained. Victory, however, came at an unbearably high cost. Heroes with promising futures were lost, and, most painfully of all, the one who carried the hope of everyone was gone. All Might, the symbol of peace, had fallen. Even after losing his powers and with his body in a wretched state, he fought until his last breath. The war had been devastating, and the people's trust in heroes had been deeply shaken. The questions never stopped. Why did they take so long to act? Why so many deaths? Why did so many heroes surrender? And, worst of all, why were some of them the very people who had contributed to the creation of villains? Like Dabi, Endeavor's son, who, before perishing, burned countless innocent lives to ash. The street seemed calm, but in people's eyes, a lingering fear glimmered, as if they expected a threat to emerge at any moment, one so great that even heroes would be powerless against it. Yet, from the ashes of tragedy, new heroes rose, ready to take the mantle of those who came before them. 3 years had passed since that battle, and while the scars of war remained, things had turned out relatively well for those students who were now professional heroes. Izumi Midoriya, bearer of One for All, had established herself as the country's #1 hero. Despite this, the smile she showed in public rarely reached her eyes, for she had yet to fully process the loss of her idol. Even so, she was determined to honor his legacy and continue helping the world with the same unwavering smile that once defined him. Katsuki Bakugo, her former friend and rival, had also reached the top as a pro-hero. However, something about him had changed. He no longer displayed the same aggression as before. His temper had softened, and now, he showed a kind of affection toward her that, at times, made her uneasy. Kyoka Jiro and Mina Ashido had also made names for themselves, their work as heroes gaining increasing recognition. Meanwhile, Ibarra Shiozaki had become one of the most respected heroes, known both for her strength and her compassion. These new heroes, forged in the midst of chaos and loss, were one day summoned to the office of their former principal. Nizu had requested their help for a special mission. To ensure its success, he had assigned an experienced hero to oversee them, Mirko, who now bore a metal prosthetic in place of her left hand. The sacrifice she made during the final battle had cost her part of her body, but not her fighting spirit. Alongside Izumi, she would lead the mission. The mission seemed simple, at least in theory: investigate one of All for One's last remaining hidden bases. Izumi, Katsuki, Kyoka, Mina, Ibarra, and Mirko entered the lair with caution, moving through a long hallway covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with humidity, and it was evident that no one had been there for a long time. The walls were lined with photographs and classified documents, offering an unsettling glimpse into All for One's past operations. "This place is seriously creepy," Mina muttered, holding a flashlight that illuminated the photo-covered walls. The images depicted missing heroes, fallen villains, and unknown individuals. Some faces were marked with crosses, others stained with dried blood, giving the eerie impression that All for One had treated his targets like mere pieces on a chessboard. "It feels like we're walking inside the mind of a psychopath." Mirko, walking at the front, had a serious expression as she moved forward with steady steps. "Stay focused, there is still a lot to go through." Her voice echoed firmly down the hallway. Izumi held a few papers she had found on a dust-covered table, her brow furrowed as she read through the contents. "This talks about a project to create the perfect being," she murmured. "A being capable of copying quirks and evolving them to their ultimate form. It seems to have been one of All for One's last projects." Kyoka stepped closer to take a look, her expression tensing. "A more powerful Nomu?" "It looks that way." Izumi glanced around. "This isn't just a base. It's like a research lab." Katsuki, who had been silently examining the walls, lifted his gaze toward Izumi. He had barely spoken throughout the mission, but now, his eyes were locked on her. "Hey, nerd," he called, his voice rough but more restrained than usual. "Have you thought about my proposal?" Izumi sighed, closed her eyes for a moment, then turned to face him. Kaken. Her tone was tired. They had had this conversation too many times. I already told you before. I may have forgiven you, but that doesn't mean I'll go out with you. Move on and find someone who loves you because I'm not that person. Katsuki clenched his fists and looked away, his expression bitter. Why do you keep clinging to the past? I'm not the same person I was back then. I know. Izumi gave him a small, sad smile. But some things aren't so easy to forget. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Kyoka and Mina exchanged uneasy glances while Ibra muttered a quiet prayer. The tension in the air was thick, but before anyone could say anything else, Mirko raised a hand. Silence. I heard something, she commanded with an authoritative tone. Everyone froze, holding their breath. Without meaning to, Izumi had stepped on a hidden mechanism, triggering a lever. A metallic sound echoed through the hallway, followed by a dull noise coming from behind one of the walls. Did we activate a defense system? Kyoka asked, pressing her jacks against the floor to pick up any sounds from the other side of the wall. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. I hear something, like a heartbeat, no, several heartbeats. I don't think so. Mirko cautiously stepped forward, letting her metal hand graze the cold surface. It doesn't seem like a defense system was triggered. This feels more like a hidden door about to open. Izumi stepped ahead and began inspecting the wall, searching for anything unusual. The surface was icy under her fingers, and she paused when she felt a faint vibration. She pressed gently, and immediately, that section of the wall sank slightly, activating the hidden door's mechanism. Everyone watched as a part of the wall began to shift. There's something behind this wall. The metallic sound grew louder, and the wall slowly slid to the side, revealing a dark room illuminated by a faint green glow. What they saw left them completely in shock. Inside the room stood a glass capsule filled with a green liquid. Suspended within it was the body of a man with white hair, his muscular physique sculpted to perfection. His face was serene, almost angelic, and his body was covered in cables and sensors connected to various machines behind the capsule. The cables pulsed with a dim red light. Izumi felt her entire body tense instantly. What the hell is this? She murmured, stunned by the scene before her. Kyoka took a step back, her eyes wide as her jacks continued picking up the heartbeats. Is that even human? She muttered, astonished. I don't think so. I can sense 3 different heartbeats, in his chest. 3 heartbeats. Katsuki frowned and glared at the figure inside the capsule with disgust. That thing is not human. The man's body was flawless. His snow-white hair floated in the liquid, his muscles were perfectly defined, and his skin was smooth, without a single imperfection. His nudity was apparent, causing Kyoka, Ibra, and Mina to quickly avert their gazes, their cheeks slightly flushed. He's handsome, the girls murmured, exchanging startled looks at their own words. Mirko ignored their reactions and scanned the room, searching for answers about the figure inside the capsule. She pointed her flashlight at a flickering monitor near the machine, stepped closer, and pressed a few buttons. The screen crackled before lighting up, displaying a message that made her eyes widen in shock. Progress, 99% complete. She quickly turned to her teammates. This is urgent. That guy could wake up at any moment. Say no more. We need to take him out now. Katsuki brought his hands together, the hiss of gas releasing from his gauntlets echoing through the room. His palms began to glow with an intense orange light as he built up nitroglycerin for a massive explosion. I'm blowing him up right now. Are you out of your damn mind? Mina snapped, shooting him a glare as she stepped in front of him with her arms crossed. If you use your quirk here, everything could collapse, and we'd be buried alive. Then what do you suggest? Katsuki growled. Izumi stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the cables surrounding the man's body. We disconnect the cables. If he's being sustained by this machine, destroying the power source could stop the process. Kyoka nodded and moved closer, using her jacks to analyze the system. Alright, I see at least 10 main connections. Izumi raised her hands, her fingers glowing with small green sparks. I'm going to try cutting the cables sticking out of the capsule. But before they could do anything, the lights in the room began flashing red. An alarm echoed through the entire hallway. Warning! Warning! Containment system released. Subject ready for activation. TCH. Mirko sprinted forward at full speed, retracting her metal arm before launching it straight at the capsule. Her goal was clear: destroy the brain before the subject could wake up. But just as her fist was about to shatter the glass, a hand shot out of the capsule, gripping her arm with inhuman strength. Green liquid began to leak through the crack in the capsule as the man slowly opened his eyes. Golden, piercing eyes glowed in the darkness. Mirko, right? Mirko's eyes widened in surprise. How do you know my name? She growled, struggling to free her arm. The man gave a slight smile. One of those cables, it was transmitting information to my brain. So I know who you are. With a swift movement, Mirko leaped back, flipping several times before landing in a combat stance. Who are you? The man stepped out of the capsule, drops of green liquid sliding down his bare skin. His breathing was steady, and his golden eyes slowly scanned the room. Who am I? He repeated, his voice soft and calm. I don't know. Izumi felt a chill run down her spine. Katsuki had his hands ready to unleash an explosion, while Kyoka and Mina shifted into defensive positions. The man tilted his head slightly and gave a disturbing smile. But I'm very interested in finding out. Thorny vines slithered out from the shadows, moving toward his back like venomous snakes. He barely glanced at them, and as if receiving a silent command, the vines suddenly changed direction, shooting straight toward Ibarra. Ibarra's eyes widened in horror as she watched her own quirk betray her. What? Move! Izumi shouted, throwing herself at Ibarra. She pushed her out of the way just before the thorns could strike, but she felt one of them graze her arm, tearing part of her suit and leaving a thin trail of blood on her skin. I'm so sorry, Izumi. I have sinned by being careless, Ibarra said, placing a hand over her chest and pressing her lips together, regretting that she had harmed her friend. Her expression now held unwavering determination. But I will not make the same mistake again. Mirko was no longer on the ground. She was now above her opponent, ready to deliver a devastating blow. The tense veins on her forehead made it clear she was done playing. Die, freak! A deafening crash shook the room as her kick landed squarely on the man's shoulder. The ground cracked beneath them, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. His shoulder exploded into a mess of torn flesh and uncontrollable bleeding, staining the floor red around him. Mirko quickly jumped back, landing in a combat stance. That kick was aimed straight at his head. She muttered through gritted teeth, frustrated to see that at the last second, her opponent had moved just enough to avoid a fatal hit. But the most disturbing thing for everyone was that, despite his injury, he was still smiling. Good hit, Mirko-san, he said with an eerily calm voice. But let me try too. He vanished. Mina didn't even have time to react. The next thing she saw was the shadow of a leg descending toward her like a guillotine. Her heart stopped. Never in her life had she felt death so close. Bastard! Izumi's scream rang out. She appeared in a flash of light, unleashing 50% of One for All. Throwing both hands above Mina, she took the full force of the kick. The impact roared like thunder, the ground beneath them shattered, and the walls trembled from the shockwave. A sharp pain shot through Izumi's arms. The sheer force of the blow made her knees buckle, and she collapsed onto them. Shit! I can't feel my hands, she cursed under her breath. The man stepped back, watching her with a satisfied smile. Izumi Midoriya, he said, his voice filled with admiration. The genius heroine who, upon graduating from UA, immediately entered the top 10. And in a record-breaking 6 months, claimed the #1 spot. Truly, your reputation precedes you. Izumi clenched her teeth and glanced at Mina. Mina, now. Still trembling, Mina reacted instantly, releasing a high-pressure stream of acid, creating a cloud of corrosive smoke that engulfed the entire room. The acid sizzled as it made contact with the floor and walls. Move, now. Mirko shouted, sprinting toward the exit. The others began to retreat. Bakugo clenched his teeth, clicking his tongue in frustration. Shit! Mirko was at the rear, making sure the enemy wasn't following them. But in the middle of the acid cloud, the man began to walk calmly. The skin on his torso was peeling away from the acid, yet he seemed completely indifferent to the pain. At that moment, his injured arm had already begun to regenerate. He took the opportunity to find some clothing and, once ready, turned his gaze toward the ceiling. Then, he raised his hands in an X shape above his head and prepared to leap straight through it. The group finally emerged to the surface. The fresh air hit their faces, but there was no time to rest. There was only one way out, and the enemy was still after them. Call for reinforcements now. Mirko ordered firmly, keeping her eyes locked on the path where an attack could come at any moment. Mina, Ibarra, and Kyoka pulled out their devices and tried to communicate, but they quickly realized there was no signal. The eerie silence of that isolated part of the city only heightened the overwhelming sense of danger. No signal. Ibarra exclaimed, frowning. No luck here either. Mina added in frustration, smacking her device against her palm. Kyoka shook her head and put her phone away. We're in trouble, she murmured. Mirko gritted her teeth and clicked her tongue in irritation. TCH, the guy is strong, but at least he has an injured arm. Kyoka's jacks moved instinctively, pointing toward the ground as if detecting something. Wasting no time, she crouched down and connected them, closing her eyes to concentrate. Immediately, a chill ran down her spine. What she sensed underground was not normal. She could hear the floors collapsing one after another and felt the danger approaching fast. Her eyes snapped open, realizing there was no time left. Get away from here, she warned urgently. Without a second thought, she grabbed Mina's hand, who was closest to her, and yanked her back forcefully. What's going on? Mina shouted in alarm. Kyoka swallowed hard and answered with a tense voice. He's coming. Move now. At that exact moment, the ground trembled. A deafening crash shattered the silence as the man from before burst through the concrete with devastating force, propelling himself into the sky. Ibarra reacted a second later than the others, and that second was enough to seal her fate. The sound of concrete and metal layers being torn apart was deafening. Pieces of the structure collapsed as the ground shook violently, as if an earthquake had struck. In the blink of an eye, he was already in the air, hovering above them. In the next, he was plummeting down like a bullet. The impact of his landing sent a dense cloud of dust into the air. Fragments of concrete flew in all directions. And when the dust finally settled, horror gripped everyone. The man was smiling as he held Ibarra by the neck with one hand, as if she weighed nothing. Ibarra! Izumi shouted, struggling to get up, furious at seeing her friend handled with such cruelty. The man began walking with an eerie calmness. His footsteps made no sound, and his face displayed nothing but amusement. Ibarra gasped, her fingers clawing desperately at the hand choking her, but her strength was meaningless against the brutal grip crushing her throat. Let her go. Izumi's voice rang out like a warning. The man looked straight at her. Or what? Izumi's eyes glowed with an intense green light as her body began charging with power. Electricity crackled around her, wrapping her limbs in powerful streaks of lightning. The ground beneath her feet started to crack even more, fissures spreading rapidly, causing small fragments of concrete to float into the air from the sheer pressure of her energy. Or else. Izumi tilted her head slightly, her gaze turning lethal. I'll tear you apart. And not even Kamisama will save you. The veins in her arms became pronounced as the power of one for all surged through her body, pulsing with raw energy. Mirko, standing on the sidelines, observing everything carefully, frowned. Something wasn't adding up. She glanced at the man's arm, the one she had shattered before. It should have been completely destroyed. But it was intact. In fact, his entire body was unscathed, despite having crashed through multiple layers of concrete. That guy, could he be? Mirko muttered, narrowing her eyes. Kyoka's ears twitched at Mirko's words. What's wrong? TCH, that bastard, he has at least 3 quirks. Regeneration, durability, and enhanced physical abilities. 3 quirks. Kyoka's face went pale as she processed what that meant. He was the perfect counter to Izumi, the strongest fighter in their group. Mirko clicked her tongue. And who knows if he has more. Meanwhile, Ibarra gasped, her breathing erratic as she felt the air slowly slipping away. The man's arm around her neck exerted unbearable pressure, and her vision was beginning to darken. I don't want to die, she thought, feeling hot tears spill from her eyes. She wanted to keep living. She wanted to see the sunrise again, to embrace her friends, to help people, to love. She had never truly experienced what it meant to love. The thought of it all ending here, of her life being extinguished in the hands of this monster, was unbearable. The man watched her with eerie calm. He saw her cry, saw the fear consuming her, felt the desperation radiating from her. He observed her vulnerability, her struggle to survive, her terror at losing everything. And in that instant, all those emotions flooded into him, overwhelming his senses as if they were his own. Something stirred deep within him. A fleeting image flickered in his mind. A memory. Something that shouldn't be there. Flashback. Inside a glass capsule filled with thick, green liquid, a boy no older than 7 floated, his small frame tethered by thin cables attached to his skin and the sides of his head. Outside the capsule, several figures in white lab coats observed him, murmuring among themselves as they took notes on their tablets. The cold lighting in the room gave the entire scene an oppressive air. When the other doctors left to take a break, a woman with pale white hair and an exhausted expression stepped closer to the capsule. The child inside, suspended in liquid, shared the same hair color as her. Her deep red eyes, contrasting with the boy's golden ones, reflected a mixture of sorrow and regret, but also a profound affection. She raised a hand and pressed her palm against the glass. The boy, still floating in the capsule, stared directly at her. "Izuku," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You may forget this moment, but if you ever manage to remember my words, I want you to promise me something." She pulled a photograph from the pocket of her lab coat. In the image, a baby with white hair and a small horn on her forehead smiled sweetly. "She is my daughter. Please, save her. She is your sister." The boy inside the capsule blinked, not fully understanding the woman's words. Then, another memory surfaced. The same woman, now with a pale face and a thin trail of blood slipping from the corner of her lips. She was weak, and the desperate pounding on the other side of a metal door echoed through the room, each impact growing more frantic. Despite it all, she kept typing something into the capsule's control panel. Her breathing was erratic, weak, yet she still managed to offer him one last smile. "Maybe you didn't come from my womb, but they created you with my genes." She gazed at him with warmth, her trembling hand brushing against the glass of the capsule. "Please, my son, don't forget to do what is right." The monitor beside her flickered, displaying the name of a quirk along with its description: empathic. The ability to read and feel the emotions and hearts of others. The woman's body slowly sank to the floor, her breath fading. "I'm sorry, my son. I never expected it to end like this." She closed her eyes. "Just remember, that I love you." Her hand fell limp against the cold floor. "Don't forget your sister, her name is Eri." End of flashback. Now he remembered everything. He was not just All for One's creation. He was not just a tool in his plan or some backup for the villain. He was Izuku, and he would bow to no one. No matter what they had imposed on him, no matter the experiments or the manipulations forced into his mind, there was something they could never take from him: his will, his humanity. And the love of a mother who saw him as her son, a love that gave birth to an unbreakable desire to protect, to fight for what truly mattered. As his memories flooded back, he blinked and returned to the present, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes focused on the girl he was holding by the neck, who was on the verge of losing consciousness. With a swift movement, he released her and caught her in midair, cradling her gently as if she were made of glass. His free hand glowed with a soft blue light as he brought it to her neck, slowly healing the bruises on her skin. Ibarra's eyes slowly opened. The air still burned in her lungs, and the pounding in her temples was deafening. Her throat ached as if it had been pierced by thorns, but the comforting warmth emanating from the stranger's hand kept her conscious. "Why, didn't you kill me?" she whispered weakly. Izuku stared at her, his golden eyes glowing with an unfamiliar warmth. His expression had softened, the menacing aura that once surrounded him now seemed subdued, almost human. "Because..." He lowered his gaze to his still glowing hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "I remembered who I am." He gently placed her on the ground, making sure she was no longer hurt. His eyes shifted toward the horizon, filled with unwavering determination. "And because I have a sister to find. Ibra still couldn't grasp it all. One moment, she was being strangled by a madman, feeling life slipping away from her, and the next, that same madman seemed like a completely different person. Calmer, more controlled. When she looked at his face, she saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes for what he had done to her. A green blur shot past her, kicking up a gust of dust as Izumi caught her with a speed almost imperceptible to the human eye. Ibra felt a wave of vertigo rush through her body, and in the blink of an eye, she was already back with the rest of the team. "Mirko, take care of her." Izumi's voice was firm and commanding. "What?" Mirko frowned, but before she could react, Izumi was already face to face with the white-haired man. A devastating punch landed squarely on his face with a deafening crash, sending him flying through the air with brutal force. But Izumi didn't give him a chance to recover. Her body flashed in green and black streaks as she activated Black Whip, forming dark wings on her back. Without hesitation, she launched herself at him with lethal speed, reaching him in the blink of an eye. "And next time, don't make me angry." Izumi roared, twisting in midair before delivering a powerful upward kick that sent him hurtling toward the sky. He tried to regain control, but Izumi was already upon him. Her hands lit up with multicolored energy as she raised them above her head. "Descending hammer," she shouted, slamming him down toward the ground. The impact was so brutal that the air exploded outward, creating a shockwave that cleared the clouds and brought down several nearby structures. The villain's body plummeted like a meteor, crashing into the earth and leaving behind a massive crater. The entire sector shook as if an earthquake had just struck. Dust rose in thick spirals, temporarily obscuring everyone's vision. Izumi descended slowly, the green electricity surrounding her body dissipating into sparks that faded into the air. "It's been a while since I used 100%, Izumi said, sighing as she gently floated down, her quirk keeping her weightless. Mina, Kyoka, Katsuki, and Mirko, now with a fully recovered Ibra, began approaching the crater. Their eyes reflected a mix of awe and concern. "Do you think he's okay?" Ibra asked, genuine worry in her expression. Mina, Kyoka, and Katsuki looked at her as if she had just said the dumbest thing in the world. Izumi frowned and scolded her outright. "That villain almost killed you. Why the hell would you care if he's okay?" "I know," Ibra murmured, pressing her lips together. "But, at first, I saw him as a villain, and then, I saw that he's not completely one." Izumi clicked her tongue in frustration but decided not to argue further. The group fell silent as they stared into the crater. At the bottom, the villain's body lay motionless, his exposed torso covered in deep cuts and dark bruises. Despite the evident damage, his breathing remained steady. "He's still alive." Izumi narrowed her eyes, surprised. Few people could withstand a direct hit from her at full power. Izuku remained silent, his eyes fixed on the starry sky. But in truth, he was searching for something else. All for One had granted him many quirks, and one of them allowed him to sense the presence of others, to feel their essence, their very existence. He was searching for a specific presence. A source of energy that felt like his own. His mind scanned the area, reaching into nearby cities, passing through buildings, streets filled with the noise of people, the sounds of animals, but he found nothing. Until he did. A faint presence, but unmistakable. He was certain. That was his sister. Izuku opened his eyes, the golden glow in his pupils intensifying. It was time to put an end to this battle. He stood up, shaking off the dust. The cuts on his body bled, but he didn't seem to care. "And after all the trouble I went through to find decent clothes," he muttered, glancing at what remained of his shirt, practically torn to shreds. His pants were ripped, full of cuts and stained with dried blood, and his shoes were barely holding together, ready to fall apart with the slightest movement. Izuku sighed, rolling his shoulders to release the tension built up in his muscles. The breeze brushed against his exposed skin, and his expression relaxed, almost as if the devastation around him was irrelevant. "I guess I'll have to go shopping after this." Izumi, though impressed by the resilience he had shown, crossed her arms and frowned. The green electricity still emanating from her body flickered slightly as she looked at him with irritation. "If you're done acting like a psychopath, then you're coming with us for interrogation." Izuku lifted his gaze and studied her with a teasing expression. His lips curled into a smirk as he threw her a playful wink, his eyes glinting with mischief. "So, hero, what charges do you plan to use to interrogate me?" Izumi narrowed her eyes dangerously. The tension between them thickened, the kind that made it feel like a single word could reignite their battle. Kyoka, watching from the side with her arms crossed, let out a sarcastic chuckle. "Can't think of one. I don't know, maybe, mass destruction, seriously injuring a hero, or, maybe." Her violet eyes locked onto him with a mix of challenge and disdain, waking up from a damn capsule made by a high-level villain. More specifically, all for one. Izuku's expression changed instantly. The smirk that had been playing on his lips disappeared, and a dark shadow crossed his face. He raised a hand to his head as a familiar voice echoed in his mind. "One day, I will take over your body." All for One's voice was cold and piercing, slithering through his brain like a serpent coiling around his thoughts. Pain pulsed in his head, his fingers digging into his temple as a surge of anger burned in his gut. "Where is All for One?" Izuku's voice was low and firm, his gaze locking onto the group of heroes with a dangerous intensity. Mirko, who had been silently observing, furrowed her brow. "Dead. Why do you ask?" Izuku let out a long sigh, running a hand through his messy hair. "That bastard thought he could take over my body." His voice was cold, emotionless. "At least that's one less problem to deal with." Without wasting another second, he snapped his fingers. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from where he stood. Suddenly, he was right in front of Izumi. Everyone's eyes widened in shock, instinctively stepping back. Before they could react, Izuku reached out and grabbed Ibarra's hand. Izumi immediately sensed the danger and activated her most powerful form, pushing One for All to 100% to amplify all her abilities. Her body became enveloped in green sparks, the pressure she generated causing a violent gust of wind. She lunged toward the villain, fist raised, ready to land the final blow. "This time, you won't survive." The fierce glow in her eyes made it clear, she wasn't joking. Ibarra, however, didn't feel any danger in Izuku's touch. He was holding her hand, but not tightly, he wasn't trying to restrain her or cause her harm. His grip was firm yet gentle, as if he were silently begging her not to leave. "What do you want?" Ibarra murmured, staring at him with wide eyes. Izuku kept his gaze fixed on her but didn't say a word. Then, his eyes shifted toward Izumi. "See you later." Before Izumi could land her punch on the white-haired man, an explosion of golden light blinded everyone, and just like that, he was gone, along with Ibarra. "Aergrg. Bastard!" Izumi roared, slamming the ground with frustration, her fists shaking the earth as her rage exploded. Her sharp gaze scanned the area, but the white-haired villain and her friend were nowhere to be found. Kyoka ran a hand through her hair, still unable to believe what had just happened. Did he just kidnap Ibarra, or am I losing my mind? No. Katsuki stood with his arms crossed, eyes narrowed. That bastard didn't leave to attack her. Then what? Mina asked, still trying to process the shock. Katsuki turned his head toward the horizon. That bastard used her as a shield to stop us from attacking him. The group fell silent as the cold wind swept through the ruins of the battlefield. Izumi clenched her teeth, her fists crackling with electricity as the glow in her eyes burned even brighter. Green energy flickered in the air, small sparks illuminating her furious expression. "If he thinks I'm going to let him get away with this, he's dead wrong." Katsuki, still standing with his arms crossed, let out an annoyed scoff. "Calm down, princess. Chasing after him now won't do us any good." Izumi turned to him, fire in her eyes. "Calm down. Are you insane? He took Ibarra, and we have no idea what he might do to her. If he wanted her dead, she'd be dead already." Mirko looked at her directly, her tone dry but firm. "He didn't take her to hurt her. Something's going on, and I want to know what it is before I break his face." Kyoka stepped forward, arms crossed. "And how do you plan to do that, Mirko, when we don't even know where he went?" Mirko clicked her tongue. "For now, let's head back and inform Mizu. He'll know what to do." Izumi closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself as the electricity coursing through her body slowly faded. But the fury inside her still burned. He better bring Ibarra back unharmed, or I swear there won't be enough of him left for a damn funeral. Far from the battlefield, high above the city, Izuku stood at the edge of a rooftop, gazing out at the night. The lights of the buildings shimmered in the distance, creating a serene landscape that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had just left behind. The cold breeze ruffled his hair, making the shirt he had managed to find billow behind him. Ibarra sat on the ground behind him, hands pressed against the tiles as she struggled to steady her breath. Her breathing was uneven, and her head was still spinning from the sudden teleportation. "Why did you take me with you?" It was the only thing she asked. Her tone was soft, but it was clear she expected an answer. Izuku barely turned his head toward her, scratching his cheek with a nonchalant expression. "If I'm being honest, I just wanted someone to talk to." Ibarra stared at him in disbelief. "Seriously?" Izuku shrugged. "Being trapped in a capsule for years tends to make you a little lonely." Ibarra sighed, rubbing her temples. She was beginning to understand the mindset of this boy. Being used as a weapon and isolated for so long must have left deep scars on his mind. "Okay. Then start by introducing yourself." She pushed herself up with some difficulty, looking at him directly. When he didn't speak, she offered him a small smile, perhaps realizing he didn't know how to start, so she decided to help him. "I'll go first. My name is Ibarra Shiozaki. I'm a rescue-focused hero, and in my free time, I visit orphanages to bring joy to the children." Izuku raised an eyebrow. "Orphanages?" he asked with genuine curiosity. The wires that had fed him information had focused on Hiro's abilities, but his knowledge of other subjects was either non-existent or severely limited. Ibarra nodded, her expression softening. "Yes. Sometimes we organize events so the kids can feel safe and loved. I take them to parks, we read stories, sometimes we hold small quirk competitions, nothing too dangerous." Izuku looked at her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. "That sounds nice." Ibarra smiled gently. "It's fulfilling. I like to think I'm making a difference for them." She extended her hand toward him, as if inviting him to share something personal. "Now it's your turn." Izuku closed his eyes for a moment. His mind was filled with fragments of information, data on heroes, combat strategies, skill analyses. All of it had been embedded into his brain while he was inside the capsule. But behind those forced memories, there was something else. Something that belonged only to him. "I'm Izuku." His voice was quiet. "I have no last name, no father, but I was born from my mother's genes. She loved me, she called me her son." He opened his eyes, looking directly at Ibarra. "And now I have to find my sister." Ibarra felt her heart tighten. There was something heartbreakingly honest in the way he said it. The devoted girl, with her gentle heart, couldn't stop a few tears from rolling down her cheeks. You weren't born like the others," she whispered, bringing her hands to her face to wipe away the tears. "You were created. That must have been so hard for you." Izuku nodded silently. "Yeah." Ibarra took a deep breath, trying to calm her emotions before changing the subject. "Do you know what your sister looks like?" Izuku slowly shook his head. "I only saw a picture of her when she was a baby." But then an idea crossed his mind. He closed his eyes, and little by little, a protrusion began to form on the right side of his head. Ibarra's eyes widened in shock as a horn slowly emerged from Izuku's skull. Her hands flew to her mouth. "No way." When Izuku opened his eyes, the golden glow in his irises had been replaced by a deep, piercing red. Ibarra's heart pounded violently. She had seen that horn before. That look before. "No, it can't be. Do you know her name?" she murmured, her voice trembling. Izuku nodded. "Her name is Eri." Ibarra's eyes filled with tears. "Eri," she whispered, unable to contain the surge of emotion washing over her. That little girl had suffered so much. Even after being rescued, the emotional scars had never truly faded, still etched deeply into her fragile heart. She remembered clearly the days she spent with her at UA, the times when Eri would gaze at the sky with that melancholic expression, as if waiting for something or someone to come back for her. There were moments when Ibarra would sit beside her in the garden, holding her small hand as she told her stories about fun things to make her smile, but that lingering sadness in Eri's eyes never fully disappeared. Even Izumi, who had the closest bond with her, had never been able to make her truly happy. "Then what are you waiting for? Go get her. Ibarra said, her voice filled with emotion. She was overjoyed that, at last, Eri could be reunited with someone who truly understood her. But at the same time, a spark of anger burned in her chest at the cruelty of those who had separated them, treating them as nothing more than experiments, victims of heartless people. Izuku's eyes widened slightly. Do you know where she is? Ibarra nodded with a small smile. She's at UA now, in her first year as a student. Izuku's eyes shone with a mix of surprise and relief. He turned toward the horizon, toward the place where he had sensed his sister's presence. His golden eyes flickered with intensity as his horn slowly began to fade. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again, sharper and more focused. His pupils locked onto something far beyond the city's skyline until he clearly saw the silhouette of UA's massive building. I found her. He murmured. Izuku extended his hand toward Ibarra. Come, I'll take you with me. Ibarra took a nervous step back, shaking her head. Sorry, Izuku, but I'd rather stop praying for a day than go through another teleportation. Izuku let out a soft laugh. I promise this time it'll be smoother. She pressed her lips together, clearly hesitant. Are you sure? Trust me. After a second of hesitation, Ibarra sighed and took his hand. Izuku closed his eyes, and both of them slowly began to float above the ground. Her feet lifted off the surface, and a small gasp of surprise escaped her lips. Wait. How? Izuku smiled, amused by her expression. Relax, just let yourself go. Ibarra looked down and saw that they were ascending rapidly into the sky. The night breeze caressed her face, and her long green hair danced with the wind. She felt light, free, and for the first time in a long while, unburdened. Wow, this is amazing, she said, her voice filled with excitement as she stretched her arms out to the sides. I've always dreamed of flying, like an angel. Izuku glanced at her from the corner of his eye, a soft smile forming as he saw the genuine joy on her face. Then enjoy the ride. Ibarra closed her eyes, feeling the cool breeze against her skin. She reveled in the sensation of flight, and when she opened them again, the illuminated silhouette of UA came into view. They had arrived at their destination. There, Izuku. Principal Nizu's office is in that building. Izuku nodded and descended smoothly, landing on the ledge of a large window that led directly into the office. Just as he reached out to open it, a loud voice rang out from inside. Principal Nizu, with all due respect, we have to do something. Izumi stood in the center of the office, her face flushed with frustration. Her green hair floated slightly from the residual electricity still coursing through her body. Katsuki stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression filled with pure anger. Principal Nizu, that bastard took a valuable ally. We need to deploy every hero to find our friend. Izumi glanced at him, grateful for his support, and Katsuki smirked to himself. If he played his cards right, this could be his chance to impress her and finally convince her to go out with him. Nizu, seated comfortably in his chair with a steaming cup of tea in his hands, took a calm sip. The thing is, we don't need to deploy any heroes. Kyoka stomped her foot on the floor, visibly irritated. What do you mean we don't need to? Mina nodded, her expression just as frustrated. Ibarra was kidnapped. We can't just let this slide like nothing happened. Mirko, who had remained in the back with her arms crossed, wore a serious and piercing expression. If we don't act now, the public could lose faith in heroes again. Nizu nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. I completely agree, but... With an enigmatic smile, Nizu gestured toward the window behind them. The thing is, we don't need to do anything, because they're already here. Everyone in the room turned at the same time. Izumi frowned, her gaze sharpening as she saw two silhouettes behind the window. However, her irritated eyes focused on the boy who had not only hurt Ibarra but also kidnapped her. Izuku, unaware of the stares and anger of Japan's #1 hero, gently lifted the window and stepped inside, still holding Ibarra's hand. Ibarra. Izumi murmured, relieved that the villain hadn't harmed her. Katsuki narrowed his eyes at Izuku. You again. Kyoka stepped forward, looking at Ibarra. Are you okay? Ibarra smiled softly, letting go of Izuku's hand to reassure her. I'm perfectly fine. Izuku slowly walked toward the center of the room. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Izumi watched him with a mix of irritation and suspicion, but it was Mirko who broke the silence. "Are you finally going to tell us who the hell you are?" Izuku looked at them all and answered calmly. "I'm Izuku, a creation of All for One, but I don't share his ideals. I came here to find my sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Katsuki already didn't like the guy. He didn't know why, but the way he stood, the confidence in his voice, gave off the feeling that he thought he was superior, and that pissed him off. His jaw clenched, and a spark flickered in his palms. His instincts screamed at him to be ready for a fight. Besides, if he managed to defeat this guy in battle, he might impress Izumi and finally have a shot at making her his girlfriend. On the other hand, Kyoka and Mina exchanged confused glances. Mirko, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, tilted her head slightly, her ears twitching subtly as she observed Izuku with sharp eyes. "Sister?" Kyoka murmured, frowning. Katsuki scoffed. "TCH, don't make me laugh." Nizu smiled, setting his teacup down on the table with a soft clink that echoed through the room. "It seems things are getting interesting," he thought to himself, his eyes gleaming with that calculating, mischievous glint he always had when everything was going exactly as he had planned. Before anyone could move or say anything, Izumi stepped forward, her green aura erupting into a surge of electricity that shook the entire building. Her eyes glowed with intense emerald light. "Do you think I'll forgive you for kidnapping my friend?" Izumi's voice dripped with fury. In the blink of an eye, she vanished and reappeared next to Izuku, her fist crackling with electricity, ready to strike. Izuku barely had time to look up before the impact hit him square in the torso. The explosion of force echoed like thunder, sending his body flying with brutal power. He crashed through multiple concrete walls as if they were mere sheets of paper. Finally, he slammed into the outer wall of the building, partially collapsing it, his body landing violently in the open section of UA. A thick cloud of dust and debris hung in the air in his wake. "Izumi, don't kill him." Nizu's calm voice cut through the sound of destruction. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes still glowing with energy, and gave a short nod. In a flash of green light, she vanished into a trail of energy and reappeared above Izuku, who lay on the ground with a calm, almost indifferent expression. Izuku opened his eyes just as Izumi's fist came crashing down toward his face. At the last second, he slightly moved his head, and the punch struck the ground instead, creating a deep crater that made the entire UA courtyard tremble. He looked up at her, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Why do you hate me so much?" Izumi clenched her teeth, her breathing heavy as the electricity around her crackled violently. The answer was complex, painful, and tangled in emotions she refused to confront. She hated All for One. He was the one responsible for All Might's death, the greatest hero in history and the symbol of peace, as well as her mentor. But there was something more, something far more personal. When she was 8 years old, her mother was pregnant. Izumi vividly remembered how every night she would cuddle up beside her, speaking softly to the growing life inside her belly, telling him how much she loved him and how she couldn't wait to meet him. But then, the unthinkable happened. Her mother suffered a miscarriage. The loss shattered her. At night, Izumi would hear her crying, muffled sobs filling the house. And through her tears, her mother repeated the same name over and over again. "Izuku, my baby." Izumi had also wept for someone who never got the chance to enter this world. That wound, that hollow absence, never truly healed. And discovering that the name was now tied to someone connected to All for One only fueled her rage. To her, it was a cruel irony of fate. A villain like you doesn't deserve an answer. Izumi raised her fist again, determined to end it once and for all. But before she could strike, Izuku acted on instinct. He extended his arms and, in a swift motion, pulled her into an embrace. Izumi's eyes widened in shock. "Let go of me," she shouted, her face burning with fury at the unexpected hug. With both hands, she pushed him with all her strength. Green energy exploded from her palms in crackling sparks, but Izuku didn't move an inch. Izumi growled and started hitting him with her fists. She sent him flying against a nearby tree. The trunk shattered into splinters, but he got up again and hugged her once more. "I said let go of me." She slammed him against the ground, struck him against a wall, sent him crashing through concrete, hurled him into the air, and hit him again. But he still held on to her, his arms firm and warm as they wrapped around her body. Izumi was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling violently. Izuku had several cuts and bruises visible on his face and arms, but slowly, they began to heal. Why? Why do you keep holding on to me? Izuku closed his eyes. He could feel it. The quirk he had inherited from his mother, empathy, was in full effect. He could sense everything, the anger, the pain, the sorrow, the loss, the hatred, and beneath it all, a profound loneliness. Because you're carrying a pain you shouldn't have to bear alone, Izuku said, his voice soft, contrasting with the tension of the moment. Izumi tried to push him away again, but her strength faltered. The green lightning around her body slowly faded. Izuku rested his forehead against her shoulder and murmured, "Let me help you." Izumi remained still, her breathing unsteady. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she forced them back. "I don't need your help," she whispered, but her voice lacked the conviction it once held. Izuku didn't say anything. He simply remained there, holding her in silence. The cold wind blew gently around them, rustling the strands of white in her hair and stirring the debris left behind from their battle. The only sound that broke the silence was Izumi's uneven breathing. Her body trembled slightly against his, and though her hands were pressed against his chest as if to push him away, her fingers weakly clung to the fabric of his shirt. Minutes passed. The weight of tension and exhaustion continued to build until, finally, Izumi let her arms fall to her sides, too drained to keep fighting. Her knees wobbled, and before she could collapse, Izuku caught her gently. She sank to the ground with a shaky sigh, her eyes squeezing shut as her shoulders quivered with the effort of holding back her tears. Izuku knelt beside her, sliding his arms around her with steady but careful movements. His embrace was warm, enveloping. He didn't look at her with pity, only understanding. Izumi felt the tears she had refused to shed for years begin to spill down her cheeks. The hot drops mixed with the dirt and dust of battle as her breathing became more uneven. Izuku could feel the weight of her sorrow, and with a whisper full of tenderness, he said, "You don't have to carry this alone. You can cry, let it out, because mourning the ones you love doesn't make you weak." Izumi closed her eyes, her face hidden against Izuku's chest. Her breathing turned into small gasps as she felt her body fully relax. Izuku's hands moved gently over her back, radiating a warmth Izumi couldn't remember feeling in a long time. "You're an idiot," she murmured in a trembling voice. "Sniff, sniff, but I'll forgive you this time." She spoke as the tears finally fell, and they didn't stop. Izuku let out a small laugh as he gently ran his fingers through Izumi's hair. She remained curled up against his chest, crying like a child who only wanted someone to understand and comfort her. Unconsciously, she clung to him even tighter, seeking solace in his embrace. They stayed like that for a long time, silent, without the need for words. Just being together was more than enough. In the distance, Mina and Kyoka watched with mixed expressions of relief and astonishment. "Well, I guess it's over," Kyoka said with a sigh. Mina smiled weakly, though there was a mischievous spark in her eyes. About time Izumi stopped acting like a rock. Mirko, still leaning against a wall with her arms crossed, smirked in amusement. "Ryukyu and Empilady are going to love this gossip," she thought, watching the two with a chemistry that only existed between people who had something more than simple interest. Ibarra, on the other hand, remained composed, or at least, she tried to. Her serene expression masked the discomfort she felt in her chest. She placed a hand over the upper part of her suit, her brow furrowing slightly. "Why do I feel this?" she wondered, watching how gently Izuku held Izumi, as if she were the most fragile and precious thing in the world. But the one who stood out the most among the silent witnesses was Katsuki. He stood with his fists clenched and his jaw tight, his entire body trembling with tension and fury. 3 years. Katsuki thought bitterly, feeling heat build up in his palms. 3 damn years trying everything to go out with her, to prove I had changed, to make her see me as something more than a friend, and now this guy, who just walked out of a capsule and might not even be human, is holding her like it's the most natural thing in the world. He took a step forward, but a metallic hand landed on his shoulder, stopping him. "It's over now," Mirko said with a grin that bared her sharp teeth. Stay out of it. Let go of me, Katsuki growled, but Mirko pressed down harder on his shoulder. Don't be an idiot, Katsuki. You won't gain anything by interfering now. Katsuki let out a frustrated huff and looked away, but his clenched fist continued to tremble. As the sun began to rise, bathing the training field in a warm golden light, Izuku shifted slightly. Izumi had fallen asleep in his arms, her breathing soft and even. The tension and fury that had once been etched into her face were now replaced by a peaceful, serene expression. Izuku watched her for a moment, his gaze gentle as he brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Carefully, he lifted her in his arms. She instinctively nestled against him, her arms loosely wrapping around his neck. Nizu was waiting near the entrance. Take her to the infirmary, Nizu said with a smile. I think both of you need some rest. Izuku nodded and walked steadily into the academy. The others watched in silence, some with curiosity, others with unease. Mina and Kyoka exchanged amused glances. Katsuki, however, gritted his teeth and looked away, frustration and anger evident on his face as he watched the person he had feelings for in the arms of that anomaly. Izuku entered the infirmary and gently laid Izumi down on the bed. His hands lingered over hers for a moment before he finally stepped back. As he turned to leave, Izumi murmured something in her sleep. Don't go. Izuku remained still. Then, he smiled slightly and sat down in a chair beside the bed. I'll go get Eri, he murmured to himself. But first, I'll stay here until you wake up. The dawn light illuminated Izumi's face as she slept, and the reflection of that warm glow shimmered in Izuku's calm eyes. Her breathing was soft, and her green hair lay tangled and messy on the pillow. But on her relaxed face, there was no longer any trace of the tension from battle. Izuku watched her for a long moment, his eyes softening as his hand rested on the edge of the bed. Izumi frowned slightly and let out a quiet whimper. Her eyelashes fluttered before she slowly opened her eyes, her pupils still somewhat clouded with sleep. She blinked a few times before turning her head toward him. Izuku flashed a mischievous grin, the kind that always made Izumi want to hit him. Well, Sleeping Beauty is finally awake. Do you want a kiss from your prince, or would you rather sleep a little longer? Izumi felt a twitch in her eyebrow. It still amazed her how he could be completely calm one moment, act like a battle-crazed maniac the next, and then suddenly turn into the most annoying clown. Her eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms, giving him a defiant look. Seriously, she replied sarcastically, her face tinged red with irritation. Keep dreaming, Prince. If you keep this up, I'll be the one to invent a very painful way to wake you up every morning. Izuku smirked playfully. If you wear an apron, then sure, you have my permission. I suggest you shut your mouth before I do it for you. Izuku chuckled softly, resting his elbow on the edge of the bed and placing his chin in his hand. Go ahead, try it. Let's see if you can. Izumi was about to fire back with another sarcastic remark, but suddenly, the memory of the previous night hit her like a brick. The warmth of Izuku's arms around her, his steady breathing against her neck, and worst of all, how she had fallen asleep in his arms. Her face turned bright red as she recalled the embarrassing things she had done. She covered her face with both hands and muttered under her breath, how did Japan's greatest hero end up in this situation? Oh, come on, what are you complaining about? Izuku said with a playful grin. I know you liked it. Izumi slowly lowered her hands, staring at him with a mix of disbelief and fury. Her eyebrow twitched dangerously. What did you just say? Izuku didn't even have time to react before a pillow hit him directly in the face. MPFH. He fell backward in the chair while Izumi huffed and crossed her arms, her cheeks still burning. He sat back up, holding the pillow and rubbing his face with an exaggeratedly offended expression. Domestic violence this early in the morning, huh? Before Izumi could respond, the infirmary door swung open. A young girl, around 13 years old, rushed in, her white hair flowing gently behind her. A small horn protruded from the right side of her forehead, and her large red eyes reflected deep concern. Izumi-chan. I heard you were hurt. Eri ran to the bed, stopping right beside Izumi. Her small hands carefully rested on Izumi's arm as her horn began to glow faintly. Izuku watched her in astonishment. Eri closed her eyes, concentrating as her horn pulsed softly. A few seconds passed before she let out a quiet sigh and the glow faded. Luckily, you're just exhausted. Izumi relaxed her shoulders. I'm fine, really. Eri nodded, but then she lifted her gaze and looked at Izuku, who was staring at her intently from his seat. Her expression tensed slightly. Excuse me, is there something on my face? Izuku swallowed hard. The memories came back with an almost painful clarity. He was in the capsule, sensors connected to his body, and his mother leaning over him with a sad smile as she showed him a photo. This is your sister. Her name is Eri. And now she was standing right in front of him. His sister. Without thinking, he reached out toward her face, his fingers hesitantly moving to touch Eri's cheek. But the moment his fingertips brushed her skin, Eri tensed sharply, her eyes widening in shock. Her breathing turned erratic, and her horn began to glow dangerously. Her hand shot up, stopping Izuku's movement with surprising strength for someone her age. What do you think you're doing? Izuku blinked, snapping back to reality. He pulled his hand back slightly, his eyes filled with confusion and guilt. The panic radiating from Eri's aura hit him like a punch to the chest. I just wanted to. Eri's breaths came in uneven gasps, her hands trembling from the situation. Her gaze was a mix of fear and uncertainty. When Izuku tried to take a step closer, Eri quickly backed away. I'm sorry, she blurted out, bowing her head toward Izumi before turning and running out of the room. Izumi watched her leave, her lips slightly parted in surprise. Then, she slowly turned her head toward Izuku, her eyes narrowing dangerously. Are you going to tell me what that was? Izuku clenched his fists, feeling a knot tighten in his throat. His expression turned serious as he stared at the door Eri had just run through. She's my sister. Izumi's eyes widened. Your sister? Izuku nodded slowly. I just wanted to feel her. To make sure she was really there. Izumi frowned, trying to process the information. But, according to the files we found in the Yakuza hideout, Eri didn't have any siblings. Izuku looked away, his golden eyes reflecting a sadness that made Izumi's stomach twist. His fingers tensed slightly before he let out a heavy sigh. That's easy to explain, he murmured in a low voice. I'm not human, or at least, I wasn't born as one. Izumi's heart stopped for a moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw Izuku's expression, a mask of forced calm, but his eyes were shattered. Were you created? She asked softly, as if afraid of the answer. Her throat tightened with anguish, and nausea churned in her stomach as she considered what that meant. Izuku nodded calmly, but his gaze was empty, as if he was recalling something that was consuming him from the inside. Yes. I was created. A chill ran down Izumi's spine. It was as if the room had suddenly become colder. Izuku lowered his head, his jaw tight, his voice firm but devoid of life. Even though I'm not human, the woman who saw me as her son told me to protect my sister. That was when Izumi saw his horn begin to grow, identical to Eri's. Most of my genes come from the one who called me her son. Izumi felt a weight in her chest, as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. Her hands curled into fists as they trembled, anger rising along with the desperation of knowing what Izuku had been forced to endure. How could they do something like this? Her voice trembled with disbelief, playing with someone's life like they were just tools. Like they were just things. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't blink. She couldn't look away from him, from the way he was trying to stay strong, from the deep sadness in his gaze. Did they really think they were gods? Her voice broke on the last word, and without thinking, she moved closer from the bed and grabbed Izuku's hand. You are not an experiment, Izuku, she shouted, her voice full of fury and pain. You are a person. You are my friend. And damn it, I won't let anyone treat you like you're anything less than human. Izuku blinked, startled by the intensity of her words. But Izumi couldn't stop. Her chest burned, frustration and anger mixing with overwhelming sadness. What they did to you it's unforgivable, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. But you are more than what they tried to make you. It doesn't matter how you were born, only who you are now. Her grip loosened slightly, but she didn't let go. And I know that the person you are now is someone incredible, Izuku. Don't let what they did take that away from you. Izuku opened his mouth to say something, but at that moment, a metallic clang echoed through the room. A tray crashed onto the floor with a loud noise. Eri stood frozen at the door, her wide eyes staring at them. A tray of food lay at her feet. Her face was pale, and her breathing was uneven. "I have a brother," she murmured, her voice trembling. Izuku felt a sharp pain in his head. His quirk allowed him to sense Eri's emotions. He felt rage, hatred, resentment, fear, dark and profound emotions that came from the wounds she still carried. Whether it was because of her intense emotions or their blood connection, he saw them, flashes of fragmented memories, distorted images of Eri being dragged through dark hallways, brutal experiments, the inhuman pain she endured as she was torn apart over and over again. Izuku's heart pounded in his chest. His breathing became erratic as he tried to contain the overwhelming sensation of pain and suffering he felt from her. "Eri," he said, stepping toward her. "Don't come any closer." Eri raised her voice and took a step back, her eyes filled with absolute fear and hatred. Izuku raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Eri, let me explain." "Explain what?" Eri's voice turned cold, sharp, laced with venom. "That I had a brother who abandoned me. Or that I spent my entire life in a dark room, waiting for a lunatic to experiment on my body. Do you even know what it feels like to have your flesh and bones torn apart? Do you know what it's like to experience death over and over again?" Tears began streaming down Eri's cheeks, but her expression remained hard, filled with the pain she had tried to hide for so many years. "Of course, you don't. So stop pretending you're my brother and just leave. I don't need you anymore." Izuku closed his eyes, his heart feeling as if a knife had been driven through it. He swallowed hard, and his voice came out unsteady. "You're right. I can't change what they did to you, but at least let me show you what our mother was like." His eyes glowed with a golden light, and suddenly, Eri was surrounded by a white radiance. She felt as if her body was floating for an instant, and when she opened her eyes, she found herself in an unfamiliar place. The room was large, and there was a capsule in front of her. She realized she was inside it. Looking ahead, she saw a woman. It was an older version of herself, or at least, that's what it seemed like. The woman had long white hair, and a horn protruded from her forehead. Her presence radiated calm, but her eyes carried a deep exhaustion and sadness. Is that my mother?" Eri whispered, her voice breaking as she realized that the woman was, in fact, her mother. The image of the woman gave a weak smile. "Izuku, if you ever see Eri, tell her that her mother is sorry. If there were a way to turn back time so that neither of you would have to live through the hell you endured, I would do it without hesitation. I only hope that one day, you will both be free from the mistake I made, and be able to live in peace." Eri trembled. Her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees. "Why did I have to go through this? Why wasn't I like the others? Answer me." The image began to fade, and Izuku's voice echoed behind her. "It's just a memory, you can't change a memory. And you can't make our mother answer you." Eri felt the light disappear, and when she opened her eyes again, she was back in the hospital room, standing in front of Izuku and Izumi. Izuku was sitting on the floor, breathing heavily, his face drenched in sweat. Using his quirk to bring someone into his mind was an immense mental strain. Izumi watched them both in silence, her eyes filled with confusion and concern. Eri clenched her fists, tears falling freely down her cheeks. Izuku slowly lifted his gaze to meet his sister's. Eri bit her lip, her breathing unsteady. Why did you have to show up now?" Izuku swallowed hard, his golden eyes flickering with a faint glow as he looked at her gently. "Because I was trapped, and it wasn't my time to come out yet, but now, I'm finally free and strong enough to protect you." Eri shut her eyes tightly. A torrent of emotions rushed through her, anger, sadness, confusion, but above all, a pain she had buried deep in her heart for years. Her breathing grew unsteady, and tears began rolling down her cheeks. Everything she had been holding back for so long crashed over her all at once, leaving her completely vulnerable. "It's not fair." Her voice trembled as sobs escaped uncontrollably. "It's not fair that you were there all this time and I. Izuku opened his arms, his gaze never leaving hers. "Please, let me share your pain." She couldn't hold back any longer. She threw herself into her brother's arms, clinging to him with desperate strength. Oni-chan. Eri's voice broke as her small body trembled in Izuku's embrace. Why did I have to go through all of that alone? Why did no one come for me? Why did it have to be me? It hurt so much, every time they did it, every time they hurt me. I just wanted someone. Izuku closed his eyes, his face tightening as he felt his sister's anguish. He held her close, gently running his fingers through her hair. You don't have to be alone anymore, Eri. His voice was soft. I'm here now, and I will never leave you alone again. Eri sobbed, her tiny fists clutching onto Izuku's shirt as if she feared he would disappear at any moment. I was so scared. I thought I would disappear, and no one would care. Eri. Izuku rested his chin on top of her head, holding her even tighter. I'm here. And I won't let anyone hurt you ever again. Slowly, Eri began to calm down. Her breathing was still uneven, but the warmth of her brother's embrace surrounded her with a sense of security she had never felt before. Once her trembling stopped, Izuku lifted her effortlessly, holding her in his arms like a small child. Eri's face turned bright red as she realized how he was carrying her. Oh Oni-chan, put me down. I'm not a kid anymore. Izuku looked at her with an amused smile. You'll always be my little sister to me. She buried her face against his chest, completely embarrassed, but the warmth of his embrace made her feel safe, so she made no real effort to pull away. With a bit of hesitation, Eri whispered, You can keep your red eyes and your horn. I like you better that way. Izuku raised an eyebrow but smiled. His golden eyes flickered, slowly shifting back to that deep crimson as his horn grew once more from his forehead. Eri smiled, snuggling into his neck again. This feels better. Izumi, who had been watching everything in silence, let out a sigh of relief. She and Ibarra had tried everything to make Eri happy, but it seemed that someone had finally appeared who could do what they couldn't. Thank God things turned out well. Ibarra's voice echoed through the room as she walked in. She greeted Izumi with a slight nod before turning to Izuku. Izuku, by Nizu's orders, you won't be allowed to leave UA. Izuku smiled with an amused expression. Shiozaki-san, if you just wanted to keep me all to yourself, there was no need to go to such extremes. The devout girl immediately turned red. What? That's not. Izumi grabbed a book from the table and threw it straight at his head. Behave yourself, pervert, she scolded, glaring at him. Your little sister is right here, you need to set a good example. Izuku rubbed his forehead with a pained grimace, looking at her with mock indignation. Was that really necessary? You could have just talked to me first. Izumi crossed her arms with a stern expression. Not when you're acting like an idiot. Come on, Izumi-chan, it's not my fault that Shiozaki-san is in love with me. That's not true. Ibarra protested, her face completely red. Besides, you're not even that handsome. Izumi huffed, crossing her arms. Izuku raised an eyebrow with a playful smirk. Are you jealous, you little flat-chested fool? Did you just call me a fool? Izumi's eyes burned with fury. At least I don't have to hide my powers behind a horn. My power isn't in my horn. Izuku shot back with a slightly forced smile. And besides, it's not my fault that all your power is concentrated in, well, you know. He made a vague gesture toward her chest. What are you implying? Izumi shouted, clearly furious. Izuku ignored her as Shiozaki tried to intervene, but he quickly stopped her. And you, Shiozaki, don't act so innocent. He grinned mischievously. Between the two of you, you're the one with the best curves. Izuku. Izumi shouted, throwing a pillow at him, which he dodged effortlessly. As the three of them argued, Eri watched them in silence. But she wasn't upset, in fact, there was a small smile on her face. It was the first time she had seen Izumi and Ibarra so relaxed, smiling and playfully fighting like a family. And then, she said it. Will you be my mommies? She asked innocently, seeing Izuku as a father figure and Izumi and Ibarra as her mothers. Silence fell instantly. Izuku, Izumi, and Ibarra slowly turned toward Eri, who was looking at them with wide, sparkling eyes filled with excitement. What? Izumi blinked, not sure if she had heard correctly. Will you be my mommies? Eri repeated, her face glowing with happiness and her cheeks flushed with excitement at the thought of having a family. If Onii-chan can be my dad, then Izumi and Shiozaki can be my mommies, right? Izumi's face turned as red as a tomato. What are you saying? Eri, that's not how it works. Ibara stammered, just as red. But Eri only smiled, clinging to Izuku's neck as he watched with amusement. I think that sounds perfect. Izuku grinned, looking at the two girls who were now completely frozen with embarrassment. Izumi and Ibara exchanged a quick glance, their cheeks burning from the situation. Izumi was the first to react, furrowing her brows as she stared at him. Do you have any idea what you just said? Izuku tilted his head with an innocent expression. Huh? I just said it sounds perfect. Exactly. Izumi shouted, slamming her hand against the wall. You're accepting Eri's crazy idea that we should be. Ibara, her cheeks still bright red, murmured quietly, completing the sentence. AF family. Izuku shrugged, completely relaxed. And what's the problem? It doesn't sound so bad. Doesn't sound so bad. Izumi nearly choked. You're insane. Eri, still hugging Izuku, countered her words with a big smile. Onii-chan Izuku isn't crazy. He'd be the best dad in the world. Izumi ran a hand down her face, clearly losing patience. Of course he'd love being the dad, because that means he'd have 2 wives. Ibara covered her face with both hands. That's too bold to say out loud. Izuku simply smiled, resting his cheek on his hand as he looked at Izumi and Ibara. 2 wives, huh? That doesn't sound too bad. Izuku, both girls shouted at the same time before delivering a powerful punch that knocked him out with the force of the plot itself, making several people passing by the hospital room stop and stare. They thought Eri was just being innocent and not serious about it, and that Izuku was only playing along, but they were wrong. Weeks passed, and Eri's wild ideas continued to linger in the minds of both heroines. But something else had happened. Izuku never left UA. That cunning little mouse, Nizu, was too smart and knew perfectly well that Izuku wouldn't leave as long as Eri was there. He practically lived at the academy, so taking her away from that safe environment was nearly impossible. On top of that, getting a job outside of UA was extremely difficult for Izuku. Without legal documents or any official certification, he was invisible to the system. That meant finding legal employment or buying a house for himself and Eri was nearly impossible. One day, while Izuku and Aizawa were in the principal's office, Nizu smiled from his desk, holding a teacup in both hands. We can fix that, Izuku. Izuku raised an eyebrow. Fix it? Nizu nodded, his small eyes gleaming with cunning. If you can't enter the legal system, we'll simply create a new identity for you. Aizawa sighed, crossing his arms. That sounds illegal. Not if I authorize it. Nizu took a sip of his tea. Besides, society owes a great deal to Eri-chan for healing several heroes who were put out of action after the war. A small adjustment to the system won't hurt. Izuku smirked. Well, looks like I'll owe you one, principal. Nizu gave him a sly smile. And trust me, I won't hesitate to collect. The other important thing that happened during those weeks was that Eri remained attached to the idea that Izumi and Ibara should be her moms. Even though she was already 13 and growing up healthy, the years of loneliness and suffering had left an emotional wound in her. The thought of having a family, like the other kids, made her feel safe and loved. One day, as she walked through the halls of UA, Eri looked up at Izumi with her big, innocent eyes, a hint of pleading in them. Izumi, do you really not want to be my mommy? Izumi felt a painful squeeze in her heart at seeing that vulnerable expression. Her lips parted to respond, but Eri continued. It's just, you always protect me. And Shiozaki is so kind and warm to me too. Izumi crouched down and gently ran her fingers through Eri's hair. Eri. Eri gazed up at her with those sad puppy-like eyes, and at that moment, Izumi knew she had no escape. I can't say no, can I? She murmured, smiling softly. So that's a yes. Eri exclaimed, hugging her tightly. Ibara, who had been standing beside them, smiled warmly as her vines gently stroked Eri's hair. If Izumi agrees, then I do too. And that was how they ended up here, Izuku, Izumi, and Ibra sitting around a table in a restaurant while Eri, back in her room at UA, smiled in satisfaction, convinced she had planned the perfect date. Izumi was eating, but she frowned, still thinking about their conversation at the hospital. "Hey, Izuku." Izuku glanced at her while slurping his ramen. Izumi crossed her arms, looking at him with a serious expression. "Do you really think they're small?" Izuku blinked, confused. "Think what small?" Izumi gestured toward her chest, making Izuku choke on his noodles. Cough, cough. "You're still on that?" "Of course I'm still on that." Izumi glared at him, slightly blushing. "So, what do you really think?" Izuku's gaze briefly dropped to her chest, studying it. Nearby, a group of guys started whispering. "Is that guy checking out her boobs? What a shameless dude. Though, she's actually well proportioned." Izumi turned red as a tomato. "Hey, stop staring," she yelled angrily, making all the bystanders scatter. Izuku, unfazed, smirked at her reaction. "I like them. They're well proportioned and, they look comfortable." Izumi felt a strange flutter at his compliment, but she wasn't going to let herself fall so easily. "That's all you're going to say?" Izuku looked at her calmly, seeing right through her feigned outrage. "Well, I think they'd be pretty comfortable to rest on, maybe even to sleep on, don't you think?" Then, with a mischievous smile, he added, "Besides, they look delicious." Before he could continue, Ibra, completely red, shoved a piece of bread into his mouth to shut him up. "Izuku-san, people are listening." Izumi, her mind in complete chaos, could barely process what she had just heard. Izuku, unfazed, chewed the bread and shrugged. "I'm just being honest. And you, miss, don't act all innocent. With those hips and that wide." He didn't get to finish. In an instant, a completely red-faced Izumi knocked him out with a solid punch. "Why, you perverted idiot," she shouted, caught between fury and embarrassment. Ibra sighed and, using her vines, lifted Izuku's unconscious body while she and Izumi walked back to UA, carrying the pervert with them. The date the girls had couldn't exactly be called perfect, but whenever they found some free time in their busy schedules as pro-heroes, they spent it with Izuku and little Eri. Despite how chaotic it often was to be around Izuku, especially because of how effortlessly he could make them nervous without even trying, both Izumi and Ibra felt at ease by his side. Even though his occasional comments drove them crazy and made them blush, they couldn't deny how comfortable they felt with him, as if everything else disappeared when they were together. Even when Eri insisted that Izumi and Ibra should be her mommies, which left them blushing furiously, neither of them could bring themselves to reject her when she smiled so sweetly. That constant closeness with Izuku was beginning to affect them in unexpected ways. Izumi couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he smiled or how his eyes lit up when they were around. Ibra, on the other hand, felt a certain peace whenever Izuku gave her a soft smile or looked her directly in the eyes while thanking her for even the smallest favor. The worst part was that both of them had realized their feelings, and now they wanted revenge, because Izuku was occupying their minds 24 hours a day. In a reserved training space for teachers, the two heroines stood with Izuku. They had made a few calls, and thanks to an unsettling smile from Izumi that promised pain, Principal Nizu agreed to lend them the place for training. Izuku sat on a wooden bench, watching them with a mix of curiosity and slight concern about the reason for this meeting. The two girls, on the other hand, had an expression that could only be described as dangerous. Izumi wore a full-body black sports suit with golden accents that highlighted the silhouette of the symbol of peace. The fabric clung perfectly to her figure, shamelessly accentuating her curves, though she pretended not to notice. As she stretched her arms over her head, the movement caused the fabric to tighten, emphasizing her figure even more, especially her ample chest. Ibara, on the other hand, was dressed more modestly in loose olive green pants and a white jacket that concealed the upper half of her body. But even so, she couldn't completely hide her well-proportioned figure. The girls often teased her about not being as generous in the front as Izumi, but Ibara had a toned body and well-defined hips that spoke for themselves. Still, she seemed a bit shy about it, which was why she covered up more than necessary. Izuku narrowed his eyes slightly, observing them in more detail. It was a visual delight to see them like this. "Damn it, Izuku, Stop narrating everything you're seeing like you're telling a story. Izumi glared at him, though her cheeks were slightly flushed at what he had just implied about her body. Izuku blinked. Huh? I wasn't narrating anything. Yes, you were. Ibra smiled sweetly at him, though a vein on her forehead was pulsing dangerously. And by the way, Izuku-san, a woman is attractive even if she isn't too gifted in the front. Izuku tilted his head, still confused. Huh? What do you mean by? Izumi crossed her arms, which only emphasized her chest even more. So, a woman isn't attractive if she doesn't have much in the front? Izuku felt a chill run down his spine. I never said that. Ibra covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a giggle. Well, at least it looks like you liked what you saw. Izumi looked at her in surprise. Over the past few days, her usually reserved friend had been getting bolder, clearly influenced by Izuku. Izuku sighed and stood up, rubbing the back of his neck. He had come with them because they wanted to train, but before they arrived, they had said something strange. Let me get this straight, you want to train, but I'm not allowed to hit back. Izumi and Ibra smiled in unison. Any problem with that? Izuku looked at them as if they had lost their minds. Sounds a little unfair, don't you think? Before he could say anything else, Izumi was already in front of him. Let's see if it's unfair. A direct punch to the face sent him flying several meters back. Izuku twisted in the air and landed with agility, sliding backward to disperse the force of the impact. Just as he tried to stabilize himself, he felt pressure around his ankle. Looking down, he saw vines sprouting from the ground, wrapping around his leg. Seriously, Ibra? Don't worry, Izuku-san. Ibra gave him a serene smile as she extended her hands. More vines erupted from the ground, sharp like thorns. We're just warming up. Izuku jumped back, dodging the spikes, but in midair, Izumi was already on top of him. She propelled herself with a kick, pulling one leg back before launching it forward with brutal force. Her foot slammed into Izuku's side, sending him crashing into the ground with a loud impact. He quickly got back on his feet, pressing a hand to his stomach. Wow, you two are in a bad mood today. Izumi landed gracefully beside Ibra, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a triumphant smile. You have no idea, Izuku. Ibra glanced at Izumi. Do you think we're going too far? Izumi smirked mischievously. Nah, that idiot's tougher than a dried coconut. Izuku cracked his neck and flexed his arms, a confident grin spreading across his face. If you're gonna play dirty, he said, a challenging gleam in his eyes, don't be surprised when I return the favor. Izumi and Ibra exchanged a dangerous look, the smiles on their faces reflecting the same intent. Without warning, both lunged at Izuku at the same time, Izumi from the front and Ibra from behind. Izuku barely had time to react before a flurry of vines shot up from the ground, wrapping around his legs. With a swift movement, he spun on his heel, breaking the vines with sheer physical strength. Izumi appeared at his side with impressive speed, aiming a direct kick at his face. Izuku blocked with his forearm, but the force of the impact sent him skidding back several meters. Ibra took advantage of the opening, extending more vines that twisted toward him like serpents. Izuku jumped back, dodging with agility, but Izumi was already on him again, striking him in the side. TCH. Izuku frowned as he landed, rolling across the ground. The fight continued with Izumi and Ibra launching attack after attack, while Izuku held his ground. However, his keen observation skills allowed him to analyze their combat patterns. Within hours, the tide of the battle had turned in his favor. Using the very vines that Ibra had summoned, Izuku managed to immobilize them, trapping them with precision. Now, both of them were tied to a post, their hands bound behind their backs and their legs hanging freely. From below, Izuku looked up at them with a triumphant smile, his breathing still slightly heavy from the effort. Well, technically, I didn't hit you. So why are you looking at me like that? Izumi struggled against the vines, but they kept her completely restrained. Damn it! How did you even win? Izuku shrugged. I guess it's the power of the plot. The two girls were clearly not happy with the outcome. Izumi, who was currently the symbol of peace, felt like this was a personal humiliation. She hadn't fought at full power, but neither had Izuku, and yet, he had still defeated her. Ibra was the first to speak. Can you let us down? She asked with a hint of impatience. Izuku looked at her, amused, shaking his head. Izumi clenched her jaw and forced a smile. Please, can you let us down now? Izuku seemed to think for a moment before shaking his head again. Naughty girls need to reflect on their actions. Then, he pulled out the phone Nizu had given him. Did you know I can use this to communicate with the entire world? What are you going to do? Izumi asked, starting to feel uneasy. Eri told me I can use this to capture special moments. Izuku lifted the phone and, with a bit of clumsiness, took a selfie with the two of them tied up behind him. Izuku, don't you dare. Izumi struggled harder. Izuku checked the photo and smiled. I don't think I'll post it. You better not. Ibarra hissed, a dangerous glint in her eyes. But. Izuku smiled innocently, I sent it to Eri. The girls paled. What did you do? Let us down right now. Izumi thrashed like a wild beast. In Eri's room, the little girl looked at the photo on her phone with a huge smile. Kawaii, she exclaimed, saving the image. A second later, she sent the picture to her entire class group chat. Back at the training field, Izuku finally let the girls down, but the damage was already done. Izumi and Ibarra stared at their phones as notifications exploded. Is it trending already? Izumi gritted her teeth. Yeah. Ibarra looked at the screen. Over 1,000 comments in less than 2 minutes. Izumi put her phone away with a cold smile. Izuku. Izuku, who was sitting calmly on the ground, looked up. Yeah. Both girls jumped on him at the same time, causing a small cloud of dust to rise from the impact. Minutes later, Izuku lay on the ground, his clothes even more torn and a slight pain in his chest. Ibarra moved closer and sat beside him. So, what are we? Izuku blinked. Huh? Ibarra looked at him seriously, her expression more solemn than usual. At first, I thought dating you was a joke, but after all this time. She paused, her gaze softening. With a gentle smile, she added, I realized you're different, and you make me really happy. So, I want to give this a try. Izumi, who had also moved closer, looked at Izuku with the same intensity. I want to know too, she said, a faint blush on her cheeks. I've never felt this way about anyone before, and even though you can be an idiot sometimes, you make my heart go crazy. Her blush deepened. I think I love you. Izuku looked at both girls, seeing the sincerity in their eyes. A soft smile appeared on his face. Don't you already know? He asked, looking at them tenderly. You're my wives. Both girls stared at him, their mouths falling open. What? Wives? Izumi and Ibarra shouted in unison, their faces completely red. They couldn't believe Izuku was still going along with Eri's idea that they were his wives, and the most ridiculous part was that they weren't even married. They both laughed. Izuku really was an idiot, but they were idiots too, for loving him. Izuku laughed at their exaggerated reaction. If we've already spent so much time together, why not make it official? Ibarra sighed, then smiled mischievously. How about we start as boyfriend and girlfriends first, she suggested, looking at Izuku with a playful smile. Izumi smiled as well, taking Izuku's hand. Yeah. I like that idea, she said with a soft gaze. Izuku chuckled, knowing that sooner or later, he would make them his wives. For now, he would humor them. Seeing them happy was all that mattered to him. Alright, I guess that means I have 2 girlfriends now. A few days later, all of UA and eventually the entire country, found out about the rumor that Izuku was dating the world's greatest heroine and the most respected religious hero. Izuku stared at his phone as the news headline flashed across the screen, humble goalkeeper doing the impossible. The golden letters stood out against the black background, and right below was a picture of him, wearing his slightly torn goalkeeper uniform, smiling alongside Izumi and Ibarra. The photo had clearly been taken after training, and the way both girls casually hugged him left no doubt about their relationship. His eyebrow twitched, a vein popped on his temple, and his fingers tightened around the phone. Nizu. He muttered, his voice carrying a dangerous tone. The comments didn't go unnoticed. Some people were even saying they would quit their jobs and follow the example of UA's goalkeeper, hoping it would improve their luck in love. That cunning little rat had promised him that working as a goalkeeper would be low-key, just a way to help out at UA, and support Eri while he adjusted to society, but clearly, Mizu had other plans. That damn rat just made me a laughingstock. Izumi, resting her head on Izuku's shoulder, glanced at the phone before bursting into laughter. Hee, wow, Izuku, you really are quite the ladies' man. Her playful grin widened as she gave him a teasing elbow to the ribs. Ibarra, sitting on the other side with her legs crossed, ran a hand through her dark green hair and smiled softly. I suppose you'll now be a divine inspiration for all goalkeepers. Izuku let out a tired sigh, but an involuntary smile appeared on his lips as he saw how both of them were playfully teasing him. However, the happiest of all was Eri. From her room, she stared at her phone with a huge smile, hugging the stuffed animal Izuku had given her tightly. Onii-chan is the best, she murmured proudly, sharing the news with all her classmates. Everything was perfect. The end of the story. You bastard. Or maybe, it wasn't the end. A tremor shook the ground, and a wave of hot air swept through the area. Izuku barely had time to react before a blonde figure, surrounded by explosions, appeared in front of them, his eyes blazing with fury. Katsuki Bakugo stood there, his expression that of someone who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. What the hell are you doing, you idiot? Izumi shouted as she watched Katsuki charge at them with a direct explosion. Instinctively, she activated One for All, but there wasn't enough time to unleash its full power. With no other choice, Izuku reacted instantly, grabbing Izumi, Ibarra, and Eri in a single motion. He turned his body, positioning himself as a human shield in front of them. A deafening blast rocked the area. The explosion struck his back with brutal force, tearing through his uniform and scorching his skin. As the smoke cleared, Izuku remained standing, holding the girl safely in his arms. Onii-chan. Eri cried out, looking at her brother with concern as he forced a tense smile. His back burned from the severe burns, but almost immediately, smoke began rising from his skin as it started to regenerate. Izuku looked at Eri and his two girlfriends with unsettling calm. I'm fine, don't worry. Then, his golden eyes gleamed with an icy, dangerous intensity. This will be Katsuki's last mistake. Every word dripped with an unmistakable threat, leaving no doubt that there would be no mercy. Izumi and Ibarra were visibly tense with worry. Izuku took a step forward, his gaze locked onto Katsuki. I'll give you 3 seconds to get on your knees and apologize to Eri and my girlfriends. Or believe me, you'll experience 10 seconds of pain before everything goes black. Katsuki let out a distorted, mocking laugh. Ha! Do you really think you scare me? His voice was sharp, each word laced with venom and hatred. You and that brat are nothing more than lab rats. You're not even human. Izuku remained still, but a dangerous glint flickered in his eyes. Katsuki spat on the ground and pointed at Izumi. And do you know what really disgusts me? That I spent 3 damn years doing everything I could to get. His lips curled into a bitter sneer, to get at least one chance. But that bitch would rather be with a freak like you. The air in the area became suffocatingly heavy. Izumi was about to lunge at him, sparks of One for All already crackling around her hands, but Izuku extended his hand, stopping her in place. She turned to look at him and froze. His eyes, usually filled with warmth and mischief, were now cold, completely devoid of emotion. That expression, it sent a shiver down her spine. It was the same look she had seen the first time they met, in All for One's last hideout, when Izuku had emerged from a capsule and attacked them without hesitation. Izuku. Izumi murmured, feeling a chill crawl down her spine. Izuku walked slowly toward Katsuki, each step echoing against the ground beneath his feet. His gaze was piercing, and his breathing remained firm and controlled. Several of his quirks began activating, reinforcing his body as golden sparks of energy flickered across his skin. Even if Izumi unleashed the full power of One for All, it would be nothing compared to him in this state. After All for One had designed his body to be perfect, surpassing even the limits of humanity. So that's what you think, Katsuki? Izuku's voice was low, but there was a barely restrained fury beneath it. That I'm not human. That Eri isn't human. Katsuki clenched his teeth, ready to strike. Don't act naive. We all know you're nothing but something that was created. You and that brat are an abomination to human life. Eri sobbed at those words, but Ibarra and Izumi held her close, comforting her. Izuku smiled, but that smile didn't reach his eyes. I warned you. The ground beneath him cracked. The golden aura surrounding Izuku intensified, and in an instant, he vanished. Katsuki barely had time to react before a fist drove deep into his abdomen with devastating force. A dry, sickening sound rang out as Katsuki was sent flying backward like a projectile. His body tore through several concrete walls, leaving deep cracks and a cloud of dust in his wake. He hit the ground hard, rolling for several meters before finally coming to a stop. A thin stream of blood dripped from the corner of his lips as he struggled to catch his breath. His hand trembled as he pressed his palm against the ground, forcing himself to stand. Katsuki staggered as he got to his feet, his breathing ragged, his eyes blazing with fury. He clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. His palm began to glow, preparing to unleash another explosion. A laugh, filled with rage and desperation, escaped his lips before he let out a savage scream. I'm going to kill you. There was nothing left in him but blind hatred and an insatiable desire to destroy. Izuku disappeared in the blink of an eye. Before Katsuki could react, he was already in front of him, his hand gripping his arm with crushing force. A terrifying crack echoed through the air as Izuku twisted his limb without mercy, shattering the bones instantly. Katsuki let out a sharp gasp, his face contorted in pain, but he refused to scream. He wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Izuku didn't give him a chance to recover. His fist crashed into Katsuki's ribs with brutal strength, sending him to his knees. This time, he couldn't hold back a cry of agony. Gasping, Katsuki struggled to breathe, sweat dripping down his face. But Izuku wasn't done yet. The 10 seconds of suffering he had promised hadn't passed. With almost cruel slowness, Izuku crouched down until he was at eye level with him. His golden eyes dimmed, shifting into a cold, empty white. Without warning, he grabbed Katsuki's fractured arms with a brutal grip. The moment his fingers made contact, a white light surrounded them. The pain was immediate. A searing, unbearable heat spread through Katsuki's hands, as if his skin were melting in acid. A blood-curdling scream tore from his throat as his eyes widened in sheer panic. What did you do to me? He shouted, tears spilling involuntarily from the agony. Izuku did not respond. He simply watched him with a chilling calm, his expression unchanging. He knew exactly what he had done. From that moment on, every time Katsuki tried to use his quirk, an unbearable burning sensation would course through his body, as if liquid fire flowed through his veins, searing his flesh from the inside. For Izuku, this was the punishment deserved by anyone who dared to harm his family. Every word Katsuki had spoken had not only offended him but had deeply wounded the people he loved. That was why he had shown no mercy. Slowly, Izuku straightened, his golden aura glowing with a radiance that seemed to challenge the very light of the sun. His gaze locked onto Katsuki, his golden eyes burning with a threatening intensity, his expression remaining impassive. If you ever touch my family again. His voice was low and cold, each word laced with a clear warning. Next time, I won't be so kind. Katsuki lay on the ground, utterly defeated. His body was wrecked from the fight, his arms trembling from the searing pain that tore through every fiber of his being. He struggled to breathe, sweat dripping down his face as he fought uselessly to hold back the sobs of sheer frustration. He wanted to scream at him, to curse him, to swear that he would get revenge. He wanted to tell him that this wasn't over. But then, he looked up, and he saw her. Izumi stood beside Izuku. Her eyes held a mixture of concern and admiration, but what struck Katsuki the most was the way she looked at him. With love. A love that was sincere, deep, a love he had always wanted but had never received. The impact was devastating, more brutal than any physical wound, more agonizing than the searing pain in his hands. That was the most painful blow of all. Katsuki clenched his teeth, his face twisting into a grimace of rage and humiliation. Silent tears of frustration welled in his eyes, betraying him, shattering the pride he had fought so hard to protect. Izuku didn't even spare him a glance. In his world, Katsuki no longer existed. The only ones that mattered were them. Izumi, Ibarra, and Eri surrounded him as soon as he approached, welcoming him into their arms. Izuku held Eri carefully, running a hand through her hair as she buried her face in his neck, seeking his warmth. Izumi, without saying a word, rested her head on his shoulder and intertwined her fingers with his. Ibarra, with her characteristic gentleness, gazed at him with devotion before stepping closer and taking his other hand. The warmth of all three surrounded him, a reminder that it didn't matter where he came from or what he truly was. He had something stronger than any origin. He had love, and he would protect it at all costs. Izumi was the first to move. She lifted her gaze to Izuku and, without hesitation, cupped his face in her hands and kissed him. Their lips met in a soft but deeply emotional gesture. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a silent promise, and I'm here, and I accept you as you are. It was their first kiss since becoming a couple, a kiss that erased all the doubts she had once carried. In that moment, she realized there was no one more worthy than him, no one else who could make her feel so complete. Izuku responded, deepening the kiss, but before the moment could last too long, Ibarra tugged at his arm, a playful expression on her face. Era, has someone forgotten about me? Before he could react, Ibarra's lips claimed his in a more intense kiss, filled with restrained desire. Her fingers tangled in Izuku's hair as she pulled him even closer, demanding his full attention. Her kiss was different, more passionate, as if she wanted to make it clear that her love for him had no limits. When they finally parted, Izuku barely had time to breathe before Eri tugged at his shirt, looking up at him with a frown. Onie-chan. That's not fair. Where's my hug? Izuku let out a soft laugh, wrapping his little sister in a warm embrace. Sorry, Eri, he said, smiling as he held her close. Here's your hug. Izumi glanced over her shoulder at Katsuki, a mocking smile playing on her lips. See, Katsuki? That's what it means to be a real man, not the pathetic excuse that you are. The word struck harder than any punch. Katsuki felt the air leave his lungs. Everything he had done, all his efforts, and still, Izumi had chosen Izuku. She looked at him with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. She had tried to forgive him, she truly had. But his recent actions only confirmed what, deep down, she had always known: Katsuki would never change. Izumi let out a sigh, her smile twisting into a look of pure disdain. Next time you try to win over a girl, maybe don't be such an asshole from the start. Izuku, who had remained silent until now, let a faint smile cross his lips as he took in Katsuki's petrified expression. Without another word, he turned on his heels and continued walking, Izumi, Ibarra, and Eri by his side. Katsuki remained on the ground, motionless, feeling the weight of his own actions crash down on him like a crushing burden. And then, he could take no more. Izuku's words had come true. In the end, everything went black. Izumi did not look back. There was no reason to. To her, the past was buried. The only thing that mattered now was the future she would build alongside Izuku and the people who truly mattered, her family. The end of the story. Thank you to everyone who watches my videos. I really appreciate the support you give. I hope the translation is correct. If there was any mistake, I apologize. Take care and see you next time.